The scent of roasted pine and slow-cooked turkey clung to the high ceilings of the Vance estate, a fragrance that usually signaled warmth and familial sanctuary. But this year, the air inside the grand dining room felt brittle, as if the slightest vibration could shatter it into jagged shards. Julia sat at the head of the mahogany table, her 70-year-old frame upright and elegant, her silver hair shimmering under the soft glow of the crystal chandelier. She looked at the faces of her family, searching for a trace of the holiday spirit she had spent weeks preparing for. But all she found was a cold, calculated distance. To her right sat her only son, Mark. He was 35 now, wearing a navy suit that looked expensive, but couldn't hide the restless, agitated energy vibrating off him. Beside him was Chloe, his wife of 5 years. Chloe was a woman who moved with a sharp, feline grace, her eyes constantly scanning the room as if appraising the value of every antique vase and velvet curtain. For months, Julia had felt Chloe's influence weaving through Mark like a slow-acting poison, turning his natural affection into a bitter, resentful entitlement. Resting quietly beside Julia's plate was a small box wrapped in delicate gold foil. Inside that box sat a legal document, a deed of gift she had intended to present to Mark as his Christmas surprise. It was the key to a $4 million inheritance left to her by her late husband. Wealth she had kept hidden for years, living a modest life on a small pension, to ensure her son learned the value of hard work. She had decided that this was finally the year he was ready to inherit his father's legacy. The dinner started in a strained silence, broken only by the rhythmic clinking of silverware against fine china. Julia tried to bridge the gap, mentioning how the snow outside reminded her of the winters when Mark was a boy. But he only gave a hollow grunt in response. Chloe, however, didn't remain silent for long. She leaned toward Mark, her voice a low, melodic hum that carried just enough volume for Julia to hear. She spoke of their struggling business, the embarrassment of their mid-sized car, and how others with far less history had far more luxury. "It's just exhausting, Mark," Chloe sighed, her eyes flicking toward Julia with a performative sadness. "Living like we're constantly on the edge while your mother sits in this giant museum of a house. It's almost selfish, isn't it? To keep all this space when we could be truly thriving." Julia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter draft. She watched her son's face darken, his jaw tightening as Chloe's words took root. He looked at his mother, not with love, but with a growing irrational anger. He saw a 70-year-old woman he believed was a financial burden, someone who hoarded a house he felt he should already own. Mark finally snapped. He slammed his fork down, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. "She's right, Mom," he spat, his voice trembling with a redirected frustration. "Look at this place. Look at your life. You stay here, dragging us down with your needs and your traditions, while we're out there actually trying to build something." Julia didn't flinch. She set her glass of water down with a steady hand. "Mark, I have provided everything you've ever needed. This house is your home too." "Home?" Mark laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "It's a prison. Chloe and I are tired of playing the part of the dutiful children while you contribute nothing but memories of Dad." He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a cruel intensity. "Honestly, Mother, I wish you weren't my mother. I would have lived a much better, wealthier life without you dragging us down. If you weren't here, I'd actually have the start I deserve instead of waiting for your scraps." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence that didn't just fill the room, it redefined it. Julia looked at the son she had raised, the boy she had protected, and the man she had planned to make a millionaire by the end of the night. She saw the sneer on his face and the triumphant, smug glint in Chloe's eyes. They were vultures, waiting for a death that hadn't come yet, completely unaware that the scraps they despised were actually a fortune. Julia's gaze drifted to the gold-wrapped box beside her plate. She thought of her late husband, who had trusted her to use this money to ensure their son's happiness. But looking at Mark now, she realized that giving him this money wouldn't bring him happiness. It would only feed the monster Chloe had created. It would be a reward for his cruelty, a prize for his betrayal. "I understand, Mark," Julia said softly, her voice devoid of its usual warmth, sounding instead like the cracking of thin ice. "Oh, do you?" Chloe interjected, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. Because we really think it's time to discuss moving you to that assisted living facility we saw. It would be so much easier for everyone." Julia ignored her. She kept her eyes on Mark, who refused to meet her gaze, already looking at the room as if he were measuring it for new carpet. She realized then that the bond of motherhood, which she had held sacred for 35 years, had been severed by a single greedy blow. She wasn't a mother to him anymore. She was an obstacle. With a slow, deliberate movement, Julia picked up the gold box. She didn't open it. She didn't explain what was inside. She simply tucked it under her arm and stood up, her 70-year-old spine straighter than it had been in years. "Dinner is over," she announced. "What? We haven't even had dessert," Chloe complained, her eyes fixed on the gold box, wondering if it contained a piece of jewelry she could sell. "There will be no dessert," Julia replied. "And there will be no further discussion tonight. I am going to my room. I suggest you both decide what your better life looks like, because the one you have here is about to change." She walked out of the dining room without looking back, leaving the turkey to go cold and her son to sit in the wreckage of a bridge he had just burned. Upstairs, in the quiet of her bedroom, Julia sat at her vanity and looked at her reflection. She didn't see an old lady dragging them down. She saw a woman who still held all the cards. She looked at the gold box one last time, then placed it in her safe. The $4 million would not be a gift tonight. It would be her ticket to a new beginning, one that didn't include the son who wished she didn't exist. The silence that Julia left behind in the dining room was not a peaceful one. It was heavy and suffocating, like the air before a devastating storm. Downstairs, the clinking of a single fork against a plate echoed sharply as Mark attempted to resume eating. But the appetite he had arrived with had vanished, replaced by a restless, gnawing agitation. Chloe sat perfectly still, her eyes narrowed as she stared at the vacant doorway where Julia had just stood. "It didn't look like an heirloom, Mark." "It looked like a statement," Chloe countered, standing up to pace the length of the expensive Persian rug. "We had her right where we wanted her. The pressure was working. Heaving her into that facility would have opened up this entire estate for us to liquidate. But that box, the way she held it, something changed in her eyes." Mark slammed his hand on the table, the vibrations rattling the fine china. "I said it doesn't matter. Did you hear what I told her? I finally said what I've been feeling for years. I'm tired of being the dutiful son to a woman who contributes nothing but her presence. I told her I wish she wasn't my mother, and I meant it. We don't need her jewelry or her blessing. We just need her out of our way so we can live the life we were meant for." Upstairs, Julia was far from senile, and she was certainly not hiding. She sat at her mahogany writing desk, the gold-wrapped box resting in front of her like a silent witness to her betrayal. She didn't cry. The tears had dried up the moment her son wished for her non-existence. Instead, she felt a strange, cold clarity, a sense of liberation she hadn't felt since her husband, Victor, had passed away. For years, she had played the role of the modest pensioner, the quiet mother, and the aging widow, all to protect Mark from the burden of unearned wealth. She had wanted him to be a man of character before she made him a man of fortune. She realized now that she had failed. Or perhaps, she had succeeded too well in shielding him from reality, allowing Chloe to fill the void with greed. Julia reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a sleek, black leather-bound folder. Inside were the access keys to a world Mark didn't know existed, the digital and physical proofs of the $4 million inheritance. This wasn't just a pile of cash. It was a carefully managed portfolio of offshore accounts, Swiss trusts, and private investments that Victor had spent a lifetime building. The gold-wrapped box contained the master deed of gift, a document that, until 10 minutes ago, was supposed to bear Mark's name. With a steady hand, Julia picked up her fountain pen. She didn't sign the document. Instead, she drew a single thick line through Mark's name. The ink was black and permanent, mirroring the darkness she now felt toward her son's entitlement. "You wanted to know what your life would be like without me, Mark," she whispered into the empty room. "Now I am going to show you." She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. It was her private attorney, a man who had served Victor with absolute discretion. He answered on the third ring, his voice surprised to hear from her on Christmas night. "Arthur, it's Julia," she said. her voice steady and devoid of emotion. "I need to make immediate changes to the Vance Trust. All of them. I am revoking the deed of gift I prepared for Mark. I also need to activate the immediate dissolution clause for the monthly subsidies I've been filtering into his business accounts." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Julia, that is a significant amount of support. Without those subsidies, his firm will likely default within 60 days. "I am aware," Julia replied, glancing at the suitcase she had already pulled from the closet. "I am also moving the primary residence into a blind trust. I will be leaving tonight. I want the locks changed by noon tomorrow, and I want a formal eviction notice served to whoever is inside." "And the $4 million? Arthur asked. Julia looked at the gold box. "It is being moved to a private foundation in Switzerland. I'll be handling the final signatures in person. I'm taking my life back, Arthur. My son wished I wasn't his mother, so I am going to grant him that wish. From tonight he has no mother, and certainly no benefactor." As she hung up, she felt a profound sense of peace. She spent the next hour packing with an efficiency that would have terrified Mark. She didn't take much, just her passport, her jewelry, and a few cherished photos of Victor. She left the expensive dresses, the antiques, and the memories of a son who no longer existed to her. She checked her reflection in the mirror one last time. At 70, her eyes were still sharp, and the steel in her spine was unbreakable. She tucked the gold foil box into her carry-on bag. It would no longer be a gift for a son. It would be the fuel for her own grand finale. Downstairs, the house was quiet. Mark and Chloe had retreated to the guest wing, likely whispering about their plans to take over the museum they called a home. They were so convinced of her weakness that they didn't even hear the front door open. They didn't hear the soft purr of the car service Julia had summoned. And they certainly didn't see the woman they called a burden step into the winter night. A millionaire who had just decided to become a ghost. As the car pulled away from the Vance estate, Julia looked back at the glowing windows. She thought of the turkey still on the table and the Christmas tree standing tall in the parlor. By tomorrow, Mark and Chloe would wake up to a house that was no longer theirs, a bank account that was rapidly emptying, and a mother who had finally, decisively, disappeared with the fortune they never knew they had lost. The better life Mark had wished for was about to begin. It just wasn't the one he had imagined. The morning of December 26th arrived with a deceptive stillness, the kind of quiet that usually follows a heavy snowfall. Inside the Vance estate, the heating system hummed with its usual mechanical precision, but the warmth seemed unable to penetrate the thick, stagnant air of the guest wing. Mark woke up with a pounding headache, the remnants of the expensive wine and the adrenaline of last night's confrontation still coursing through his veins. Beside him, Chloe was already awake, sitting upright in bed with her laptop open, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. "She's still in her room," Chloe said, her voice sharp and devoid of morning softness. "I checked the hallway 10 minutes ago. The door is closed, and there's no sound coming from inside. She's probably waiting for an apology that isn't coming." Mark groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Let her wait. After what I said, she needs to understand that the power dynamic in this house has changed. I'm 35 years old, Chloe. I shouldn't have to ask for my own inheritance like a child begging for an allowance." "We need to move fast, Mark," Chloe insisted, her fingers tapping rapidly against the trackpad. "If she's going to be difficult, we need to have the paperwork for the assisted living transition ready by the end of the week. Once she's settled there, we can begin the process of putting the house on the market. I've already contacted a real estate agent who specializes in historic estates. He thinks we could get a premium if we sell before the spring." Mark nodded, fueled by the vision of a better life that didn't include his mother's presence or her modest, restrictive lifestyle. He imagined the millions they would make from the sale of the house and the antiques, finally giving him the capital he needed to expand his struggling firm without her scraps holding him back. They dressed in silence, moving through the house with a newfound sense of ownership. They walked into the kitchen, expecting to find Julia brewing tea or preparing a light breakfast as she had done every morning for decades. Instead, the kitchen was immaculate, the surfaces cold and bare. The half-eaten turkey from the night before was still sitting in the dining room, the gravy congealed and the vegetables shriveled. a grim monument to the bridge Mark had burned. "Mother!" Mark called out, his voice echoing through the foyer. "We need to talk about the house and your future arrangements." There was no answer. Chloe frowned, her feline grace replaced by a sudden uneasy tension. Maybe she's really sick. Or maybe she's just being dramatic. She marched up the stairs, Mark following close behind, his annoyance growing with every step. He was ready for a fight, ready to double down on his cruelty to ensure he got what he felt he deserved. When they reached Julia's bedroom door, Mark didn't knock. He gripped the handle and shoved it open, his mouth already forming a sharp command for her to come downstairs. The room was empty. At first, Mark thought she was simply in the ensuite bathroom, but as his eyes scanned the space, the reality began to sink in. The bed was perfectly made, the pillows fluffed as if no one had slept there. The wardrobe door stood slightly ajar, revealing empty hangers where her favorite coats and silk dresses usually hung. The vanity, usually cluttered with old perfume bottles and framed photos of his father, was stripped bare. "She's gone," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling not with concern, but with the sudden realization that their burden had taken something with her. Mark rushed to the small floor safe in the corner of the room. It was wide open, its interior as hollow as the house now felt. The gold-wrapped box was nowhere to be found. Where did she go? Mark shouted, spinning around to look at Chloe. "She's 70 years old. She can't just disappear in the middle of the night. She doesn't have the money for a hotel, and she certainly doesn't have the courage to leave this house." But as he stood in the center of the vacant room, the silence began to speak. It told a story of a woman who had been far more capable than he had ever allowed himself to believe. It told a story of a mother who had heard his wish for her to be gone, and had decided to grant it with a terrifying, absolute finality. "The gold box," Chloe breathed, her eyes wide with a frantic greed. "Mark, whatever was in that box, she took it. We need to find her. We need to find her right now before she does something stupid with whatever jewelry or cash she was hiding." Mark grabbed his phone and dialed Julia's number. "The subscriber you are trying to reach is no longer in service." He tried again, his heart hammering against his ribs. Same result. He sprinted back downstairs, heading for the home office. He needed to check the bank accounts, to see if she had withdrawn the small amount of savings he knew she possessed. But when he tried to log into the joint household account, the screen flashed a bright red message. *access denied. Credentials invalid star. "What is happening?" he yelled, slamming his fist against the desk. Just then, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp, persistent sound that seemed to cut through his panic. "That must be her," Chloe said, rushing to the door with a look of predatory relief. She probably realized she has nowhere to go, and is coming back to apologize. But when Chloe threw open the heavy oak door, it wasn't Julia standing on the porch. It was a man in a dark, professional coat holding a briefcase and a stack of legal documents. Behind him, two men in gray uniforms were already beginning to unload a set of heavy-duty locks from a van parked in the driveway. "Mr. and Mrs. Vance?" the man asked, his voice professional and entirely unsympathetic. "Who are you?" Mark demanded, stepping into the foyer. "My name is a representative from Arthur Sterling's office," the man replied, handing Mark a thick envelope. "I am here on behalf of Mrs. Julia Vance. She has officially moved this property into a blind trust, and has revoked all residency permissions for any third parties, including yourselves." Mark's face went pale. "What? This is my family home. She can't do that." "Actually, she can," the representative said, stepping aside to let the locksmiths enter. "As of midnight, Mrs. Vance is no longer the primary resident. You have until noon today to vacate the premises. These documents also include a formal notice that all monthly subsidies to your business accounts have been permanently terminated, effective immediately." "Terminated?" Chloe shrieked. "That's impossible. Those subsidies are the only thing keeping the firm afloat." "My client was very clear," the man said, looking at Mark with a cold, piercing gaze. "She is granting you the wish you made last night. You are now free to live your life without her dragging you down. You have exactly 3 hours to pack your things before the security team arrives to escort you from the property." The gold-wrapped box was gone. The $4 million was a ghost Mark hadn't even known existed. and the better life he had demanded had arrived like a guillotine. Julia had disappeared into the night, taking the fortune and the future with her, leaving Mark and Chloe standing in a house that was no longer theirs, surrounded by the cold, expensive silence of their own greed. The clock on the dashboard of the sleek black sedan read 1:15 a.m. as it glided away from the Vance estate, its tires crunching softly over the fresh layer of Christmas snow. Inside the back seat, Julia sat in a silence that was no longer suffocating, but liberating. For 70 years, she had played the roles assigned to her: daughter, wife, mother, always putting the needs of others before the quiet rhythm of her own heart. But as the lights of the grand house faded into the darkness behind her, she felt the heavy weight of those roles slip away, left behind in the wreckage of a dinner table that had seen the death of her patients. Beside her sat the small gold-wrapped box, its foil shimmering under the passing streetlights. To Mark it had been a mystery, to Chloe it had been a target. To Julia, it was now a symbol of her independence. Inside was not just a document for $4 million, but the physical manifestation of her late husband Victor's belief in her. He had left it to her discretion, trusting her to know when and how to pass it on. He had never imagined that the son they raised would use his breath to wish her out of existence. "Where to, Mrs. Vance?" the driver asked softly, his eyes meeting hers in the rearview mirror. He was a man Julia had known for years, one of the few Victor had trusted with the private logistics of their lives. "The airport, Marcus," Julia replied, her voice firm. "And then perhaps somewhere the air is thin and the world is quiet." As the car sped toward the city, Julia opened her leather-bound folder and pulled out a tablet. With the practiced ease of a woman who had spent decades managing the background of a multinational corporation, she logged into the Vance private cloud. The digital interface hummed to life, displaying a complex web of accounts that Mark had never been allowed to see. He had always assumed his mother was technologically illiterate, a relic of a bygone era who struggled with a television remote. It was a misconception she had allowed him to keep, finding it easier to hide her strength in the shadow of his arrogance. She began the Midnight Protocol that she and Arthur Sterling had designed for an emergency she had prayed would never come. With a few precise taps, she initiated the transfer of the $4 million inheritance into a private foundation based in Geneva. The money moved through encrypted channels, vanishing from the reach of domestic courts or the grasping hands of a resentful son. She watched the progress bar slide across the screen with a cold sense of satisfaction. Every percentage point represented a step further away from the life of a burden and closer to the life of a ghost. Next, she turned her attention to the household accounts. Mark's business, Vance Global Logistics, had been bleeding capital for 2 years, propped up entirely by anonymous monthly subsidies that Julia had filtered through a shell company. Mark believed he was a self-made titan, a visionary who had turned his father's modest firm into a modern success. He didn't know that every payroll he met and every contract he secured was backed by his mother's quiet intervention. Julia hovered her finger over the terminate button. She remembered the sneer on Mark's face at dinner, the way he had dismissed her as a drain on his resources. "You want to see what your life is like without me dragging you down, Mark?" she whispered to the glowing screen. "Let's see how well you swim without my hand holding your head above water." She pressed the button. In an instant, the recurring wire transfers were deleted. The standing credit lines were retracted. The invisible foundation of Mark's better life crumbled into digital dust. By the time he woke up, he would be a man standing on a sinking ship, wondering why the ocean was suddenly so cold. The car arrived at a private terminal on the outskirts of the city. Julia stepped out into the crisp air, the gold box tucked securely under her arm. Arthur Sterling was waiting for her near the entrance, his face etched with a mixture of concern and professional admiration. "Everything is ready, Julia," Arthur said, handing her a small envelope. "The Swiss accounts are active. The house is under lockdown. The eviction notice will be served at 9 a.m. sharp. I've also taken the liberty of freezing the joint credit cards. You are, for all intents and purposes, invisible." Julia nodded, taking the envelope. "Thank you, Arthur. For everything. I'm sorry it came to this," he added softly. Victor always hoped Mark would grow into the name. "Victor loved him," Julia said, looking toward the private jet waiting on the tarmac. But Victor also loved the truth. And the truth is that Mark is his wife's creation now. He chose Chloe's greed over my grace. Now he will have to live with the consequences of that choice. She walked toward the plane, her footsteps light on the metal stairs. As she took her seat in the cabin, she finally allowed herself to open the gold foil box. She pulled out the document, the deed of gift that would have made Mark a multimillionaire on Christmas night. She looked at his name, printed in elegant script, and felt nothing but a distant, hollow pity. She took a lighter from the side pocket of her bag and flicked it to life. The flame danced for a moment before she held it to the corner of the paper. The fire caught quickly, curling the edges and turning the $4 million promise into black, floating ash. She watched it burn until only the heat remained in her fingertips, then dropped the remains into a crystal tray. The plane began its ascent, lifting Julia Vance above the clouds and away from the only life she had ever known. Below her, in the quiet suburbs, Mark and Chloe were likely dreaming of the house they would sell and the jewelry they would pawn. They were dreaming of a world without Julia, unaware that their wish had been granted with a terrifying precision. Julia leaned back and closed her eyes. The $4 million was safe. The house was gone. The son who wished her dead was now effectively alone in a world he wasn't prepared to face. As the aircraft leveled out at 30,000 feet, Julia Vance finally allowed herself a small, weary smile. She was 70 years old, she was alone, and she was wealthier than she had ever been. Not just in money, but in the absolute, shimmering freedom of having nothing left to lose. The morning of December 26th broke over the suburbs with a frigid, mocking clarity. Inside the Vance estate, the air was unnervingly still, the silence amplified by the absence of the small, rhythmic sounds that usually defined Julia's presence. There was no clinking of a tea stirrer, no soft footsteps on the hardwood, and no hum of the radio tuned to the morning news. Chloe was the first to stir, her mind already racing with the logistical details of the transition she had planned for her mother-in-law. She expected to find Julia in the kitchen, perhaps eyes red from a night of weeping, ready to be molded by the generous offer of a high-end assisted living facility. Instead, Chloe found a house that felt like a hollow shell. She stormed into the dining room, her nose wrinkling at the sight of the cold turkey and the abandoned feast from the night before. "Mark, wake up," she shouted toward the stairs. "She hasn't even cleared the table. The laziness is getting out of hand." Mark descended the stairs slowly, his head throbbing from the previous night's wine and the adrenaline of his own cruelty. He walked into the kitchen, expecting to find his mother, but the room was pristine and freezing. The back door was locked, and the alarm system was engaged, but the home indicator was dark. "Maybe she's still in her room pouting," Mark muttered, though a flicker of unease began to stir in his gut. "I'll go up there and end this once and for all. We're setting the timeline for the move today." He marched up the grand staircase, his footsteps heavy with a sense of unearned authority. He reached Julia's door and pounded on the wood. "Mother, open up. We have a lot to discuss about your future arrangements." There was no answer. He waited for a count of 10 before twisting the handle. To his surprise, it was unlocked. The room Mark entered was not the room of a woman who had spent the night in despair. It was the room of a woman who had simply ceased to exist within those walls. The air smelled faintly of her signature lavender, but the personal effects that usually crowded the vanity were gone. The bed was made with military precision, the linens pulled tight and cold. Chloe pushed past him, her eyes immediately darting to the mahogany safe in the corner. "The safe, Mark. Is it open?" It was. The heavy door swung wide, revealing an empty velvet-lined interior. The gold foil box, the one Chloe had spent the entire dinner obsessing over, was nowhere to be found. Mark felt a sudden, sharp drop in the temperature of the room. He opened the wardrobe, finding only empty hangers and a single, forgotten silk scarf on the floor. "She's gone," he whispered, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. "Don't be ridiculous," Chloe snapped, though her own hands were trembling as she rifled through the desk drawers. "A 70-year-old woman doesn't just vanish in a snowstorm. She probably went to a hotel to try and make us feel guilty. She'll be back by lunch, begging for her bed." But lunch came and went, and Julia did not return. Instead, The reality of her departure began to manifest in a series of digital and legal strikes that Mark was entirely unprepared for. It began at 10 a.m. Mark was sitting in his father's study, trying to reach his mother's cell phone for the 20th time, when his laptop chimed with a high-priority notification from his business bank. He opened the message, expecting a routine holiday update, but his breath stopped in his throat. Notice of rescinded guarantee. The standing credit line for Vance Global Logistics has been terminated by the primary guarantor, effective immediately. What? Mark scrambled to log into his corporate portal. For years, he had operated under the delusion that his firm's survival was due to his own strategic genius. He didn't know, had never cared to look, that every major loan he secured was backed by his mother's secret assets. He watched in horror as his available balance plummeted to near zero. Next came the personal accounts. Chloe, who was in the foyer looking at luxury apartment listings, let out a scream that echoed through the house. Mark! The credit cards. They're all declined. I was trying to order a car service, and the bank says the accounts are frozen. Mark ran to the foyer, his face pale. He grabbed his own phone, trying to access the joint household fund Julia had established for them. Access denied. Credentials invalid. She's cut us off, Mark realized, the weight of his own words from the night before crashing down on him. I would have lived a much better, wealthier life without you dragging us down. He had said it with such conviction, so certain that she was the weight and he was the engine. But as the lights in the grand hallway flickered, the first sign that the utility accounts were also being transitioned, he realized he had it backward. Julia was the foundation, and without her, there was no house. A few minutes later, a professional-looking man in a dark suit walked up the driveway, unbothered by the cold. Mark met him at the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. Mr. Vance, the man asked, handing him a thick legal envelope. I'm a representative from the Sterling Law Group. I'm here to serve a formal notice of eviction. Eviction? Mark stammered, gripping the paper. This is my house. I'm a Vance. Actually, the man said, looking at a tablet, this property was moved into a blind trust at midnight. The trust has revoked your permission to occupy the premises. You have until noon to gather your personal belongings. At 12:01 p.m., the security team will arrive to change the locks and secure the perimeter. Chloe pushed her way to the front, her face red with fury. Where is she? Where is Julia? Tell her to stop this nonsense immediately. The representative looked at her with a chilling, professional indifference. Mrs. Vance is no longer available for comment. She has left the country and has established a strict no-contact order through our firm. She is simply granting her son's Christmas wish. The man turned and walked away, his boots making clean, decisive prints in the snow. Inside the house, the silence was replaced by the frantic sounds of Mark and Chloe realizing they had 3 hours to pack a life they hadn't actually paid for. The gold box was gone. The $4 million was gone. The better life Mark had demanded had officially arrived, and it felt like a grave. Somewhere miles above the earth, Julia Vance watched the sun rise over the Atlantic, the gold foil box resting in her lap. No longer a gift for a son, but a map for a woman who was finally, beautifully free. The cold clarity of the winter morning offered no comfort to Mark as he stood in the center of his father's study, a room that had always felt like a sanctuary, but now felt like a trap. The representative from the legal office had departed hours ago, leaving behind a stack of documents that seemed to vibrate with a quiet, legal malice. Every clock in the house sounded louder, ticking away the minutes of the 3-hour deadline Julia had imposed. Mark stared at his phone, his thumb hovering over his mother's contact information, but the out-of-service message he had received earlier remained a digital wall between them. Mark, we have to do something. Chloe shouted from the hallway, her voice shrill and fractured by panic. She was frantically throwing clothes into a designer suitcase, her movements erratic and uncoordinated. The security team will be here in less than 90 minutes. We can't just let her take everything. Call the police. Tell them she's unstable. Tell them she's stolen family property. The police won't help, Chloe, Mark said, his voice hollow. He looked down at the legal notice in his hand. The house is in a blind trust. She doesn't even own it anymore. The trust does. And the trust has revoked our permission to be here. Legally, we're trespassers in my own childhood home. Then call the bank. The subsidies, Mark. If that money doesn't hit the business account by noon, the payroll checks will bounce. The contractors in the city will walk off the site by the afternoon. Mark felt a cold sweat break across his forehead. He pulled up the Vance Global Logistics corporate portal on his laptop. For years, he had logged in to see a steady, comfortable flow of capital that he assumed was the result of his own brilliant management. He had told everyone, including himself, that he was the visionary who had modernized his father's legacy. But as he navigated to the incoming transfers tab, the reality of his mother's departure hit him like a physical blow. The recurring wire transfer from SV Management, the shell company Julia had used to quietly fund his life, was gone. It hadn't just been delayed. It had been purged. Beside it, the primary credit line for the firm showed a status he had never seen before, revoked by guarantor. The ghost was gone, and the foundation of his better life was collapsing in real time. Without those subsidies, he wasn't a titan of industry. He was a man with a mountain of debt and a dwindling clock. It's gone, Mark whispered, his eyes fixed on the screen. Everything. She didn't just leave, Chloe. She cut the oxygen. Chloe dropped a stack of silk scarves and rushed to the desk, shoving her face near the screen. What do you mean gone? Where is the $4 million? The jewelry? The gold box? The $4 million doesn't exist here anymore, Mark realized, the weight of his own arrogance finally crushing him. That box she was holding at dinner, that was it. That was the gift. She was going to give it to me last night. She was going to make us millionaires on Christmas night. He looked at Chloe, the woman who had spent years whispering into his ear, turning his frustration into a weapon against the woman who had been his only safety net. But I told her I wish she wasn't my mother, he said, his voice trembling. I told her I'd be better off without her dragging me down. And she listened. She gave me exactly what I asked for. Chloe didn't look at him with sympathy. She looked at him with a sudden, sharp disgust. You dunderhead, she hissed, her predatory nature turning on him now that the spoils were gone. You couldn't even wait one more night? You had to play the big man right when she was holding the checkbook? Now look at us. We're being kicked out like vagrants while she's probably sipping champagne on a private jet. The argument escalated into a bitter, ugly exchange of blame, their words echoing through the hollow halls of the Vance estate. The love they had claimed to share, built entirely on the expectation of Julia's wealth, evaporated in the face of their sudden poverty. They moved through the house like ghosts themselves, packing what they could as the noon deadline approached. At exactly 11:55 a.m., two black SUVs pulled into the snow-covered driveway. Four men in dark security uniforms stepped out, their faces unmoving and professional. They didn't offer apologies. They didn't ask questions. They simply stood by the door and waited for the clock to strike 12. Mark walked out of the house he had lived in for most of his life, carrying 2 suitcases and a box of office supplies. Chloe followed, her face red with fury and embarrassment, clutching her designer bags as if they were the only things left that gave her value. They stood on the sidewalk as the locksmiths finished changing the heavy brass locks. The security team didn't say a word as they watched the couple climb into their mid-sized car. The one Chloe had called an embarrassment just the night before. As Mark started the engine, he looked up at his mother's bedroom window. It was dark and empty, a perfect reflection of the relationship he had destroyed. He checked his business email on his phone one last time. A notification from his CFO was waiting for him. Asterisk urgent. Bank has called in the short-term loan. We need a $4 million infusion by Friday, or we file for bankruptcy. The number was a taunt. $4 million. The exact amount of the ghost inheritance Julia had taken into the night. Mark drove away from the estate, the tires spinning briefly in the slushy snow before catching the road. He had no mother to call, no subsidies to rely on, and a wife who was already looking at her phone, likely searching for an exit strategy of her own. The better life he had demanded had officially begun, and as the Vance estate disappeared in his rearview mirror, Mark Vance realized with a terrifying clarity that he was entirely alone in a world that didn't care about his name. Somewhere across the ocean, in the thin, quiet air of the Swiss Alps, Julia Vance was finally resting. She had granted her son's wish, and in doing so, she had reclaimed the only thing she had left to give: her absence. The silence was her victory, and the $4 million was her peace. The Swiss Alps were blanketed in a pristine, diamond-dusted white that made the grand estate in the distance look like a frozen palace. Julia sat on her private balcony, wrapped in a cashmere shawl, watching the sun dip behind the jagged peaks. In her hand was a cup of herbal tea, its steam rising in thin, elegant curls into the crisp mountain air. For the first time in decades, the silence surrounding her was not a reminder of what she had lost, but a celebration of what she had reclaimed. She was 70 years old, and she had never felt more alive. On the table beside her sat a small, mahogany box, no longer wrapped in gold foil, but open to reveal a set of keys and a heavy signet ring that had belonged to Victor. The $4 million were no longer a hidden secret or a potential gift for an ungrateful son. They were now the foundation of the Victor and Julia Vance Global Literacy Fund. She had spent the last week finalizing the paperwork with her Swiss attorneys, ensuring that the wealth would build schools and libraries across the world rather than funding the hollow greeds of Chloe and Mark. Her phone, a new device with a number known only to Arthur Sterling and her closest legal advisors, buzzed softly. It was a message from Arthur. The Vance estate is officially secured. Mark and Chloe have vacated the premises. The liquidation of the business assets has begun. They are currently staying in a small rental near the docks. Julia read the message and felt a distant, muted pang of sorrow. Not for the man Mark had become, but for the little boy who used to believe in Christmas magic. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who had wished for his mother's non-existence, so he could live a better life. She had granted that wish with a finality that Mark had clearly never anticipated. Without her secret monthly subsidies, his logistics firm had crumbled within weeks, exposed as a hollow shell that relied on her grace rather than his competence. In a small, cramped apartment miles away, Mark sat at a kitchen table that smelled of stale coffee and damp wood. The better life he had demanded was now a daily struggle for survival. Chloe was in the other room, her voice raised in a sharp, bitter argument with a debt collector over the phone, a sound that had become the soundtrack of their new reality. Their expensive suits were being sold online for pennies on the dollar, and the designer bags Chloe once clutched like trophies were being pawned to pay for groceries. Mark looked at his hands, which were now calloused from a job he had been forced to take at a local warehouse, the kind of manual labor he had once mocked. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the gold-wrapped box. He saw his mother's calm, steel-gray eyes as she stood up from the dinner table and walked out of his life. He realized now that he hadn't been dragged down by her. He had been kept afloat by her. He had traded a life of infinite protection for a moment of arrogant cruelty, and the price was a debt he could never repay. Back in the Alps, Julia stood up and walked to the edge of her balcony. She looked down at the valley below, where the lights of the village were beginning to twinkle like fallen stars. She thought about the gold box one last time. It had contained the master deed for the $4 million, a document that would have changed Mark's world forever. Instead, it had become the catalyst for her own rebirth. She had used the ashes of that burned document to light the way toward a future where she was no longer a bystander in her own story. She had no son to call her on holidays, and she had no daughter-in-law to whisper poison into her family's ears. But she had peace. She had the memory of Victor, untainted by the disappointment of their son. And she had the knowledge that the Vance legacy was finally doing something meaningful in the world. As the stars began to fill the vast Swiss sky, Julia Vance turned and walked back into her warm, quiet home. She closed the glass doors, locking out the cold and the past with a single, decisive click. The $4 million were gone from her son's reach. The house was a memory, and the burden he had despised was now a legend in a world he would never touch. Julia Vance sat down by her fireplace, picked up a book she had been meaning to read for years, and finally truly smiled. The silence was her own, and it was beautiful.